The Secret Behind the Lace Curtains, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins on a quiet village street, where lace curtains hang neatly in every window and nothing ever seems quite out of place. In St. Mary Mead, those delicate curtains have always served two purposes: keeping secrets inside, and allowing careful eyes to watch the world outside. But when a strange incident occurs in one of the village homes, Miss Marple begins to suspect that someone has been seeing far more than they are willing to admit. Small details start to emerge: a shadow moving behind the lace, a window that was supposedly closed, and a witness who claims to have seen nothing at all. As Miss Marple gently pieces together the truth, she realizes that the quiet windows of the village may have been hiding something important all along. Because sometimes, the most revealing clues are hidden behind the softest curtains. Before we uncover the secret hidden behind the lace curtains, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Secret Behind the Lace Curtains. The village of St. Mary Mead was known for its quiet charm. Small cottages lined the narrow lanes, each with carefully tended gardens and windows dressed with delicate lace curtains. To anyone passing through, it looked like the perfect English village, calm and untouched by trouble. People greeted each other politely, the church bell marked the hours, and life moved at a comfortable, predictable pace. Miss Jane Marple understood that peaceful places often hid the most interesting secrets. On a mild spring afternoon, she sat in her comfortable chair beside the window of her cottage. A basket of soft blue wool rested beside her as she worked steadily on a piece of knitting. The gentle clicking of the needles filled the room, though her attention was not entirely on the work in her hands. Her eyes were resting on the cottage across the lane. That cottage now belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Whitcombe, a quiet woman who had arrived in St. Mary Mead nearly a year earlier. Mrs. Whitcombe had settled into village life smoothly. She attended church every Sunday, spoke kindly to neighbors, and kept her garden neat and beautiful. There was nothing particularly strange about her behavior. And yet Miss Marple had always felt a small curiosity about the woman. Perhaps it was because Mrs. Whitcombe seemed almost too careful in everything she did. Her manners were perfect, her routines exact, and her habits rarely changed. For example, every evening at precisely 6 o'clock, she closed the lace curtains in her sitting room window. She did it carefully, drawing them together so that the room inside could not be seen at all. Miss Marple had noticed the routine many times. But today something was different. Miss Marple paused her knitting and looked at the small clock on the mantelpiece. The time was only 4:30. Her gaze returned to the window across the lane. The lace curtains were already closed. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Earlier that afternoon she had clearly seen Mrs. Whitcombe leave the house and walk down the lane. She had not returned since then. Miss Marple was quite certain of it because she had spent most of the afternoon near the window. Which meant the curtains had been closed before Mrs. Whitcombe left. That was unusual. Mrs. Whitcombe had never done such a thing before. Miss Marple resumed her knitting slowly, though her thoughts were now focused on the silent cottage. She had lived long enough to know that when people changed their habits without explanation, there was usually a reason. At that moment, the small gate of her garden opened and a familiar voice called from outside. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." Miss Marple looked up with a smile as Inspector David Ellery approached the cottage door. The inspector was an old acquaintance who occasionally visited the village when he wished for a quiet holiday away from the city. "Inspector Ellery," Miss Marple said warmly as he stepped inside. "How pleasant to see you." After a few minutes, the two were seated beside the window with cups of tea resting on the table between them. Inspector Ellery spoke casually about his journey, but soon he noticed Miss Marple's thoughtful expression. "You appear to be studying something," he said. Miss Marple nodded gently toward the cottage across the lane. Mrs. Whitcombe's house. The inspector leaned slightly to look through the window. His eyes settled on the delicate lace curtains. "Very pretty," he remarked. "Yes," Miss Marple said quietly. "They are." Inspector Ellery took another sip of tea before speaking again. "And what is interesting about them?" Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. "You see, Inspector, Mrs. Whitcombe closes those curtains every evening at 6 o'clock. She has done so almost every day since she moved here." "That sounds like an ordinary habit." "It is," Miss Marple agreed. "Except that it is only 4:30. The inspector looked again at the window across the lane. The lace curtains were tightly closed, hiding the inside of the house completely. A thoughtful look crossed his face. Perhaps she closed them before leaving the house. Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "I watched her leave earlier this afternoon. The curtains were still open then." Inspector Ellery looked back toward the silent cottage. "So someone must have closed them afterward." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. They both sat quietly for a moment. Outside, the village remained peaceful, and nothing appeared out of place. The lane was empty, and the house across from them showed no sign of movement. Inspector Ellery finally spoke again. "It may be nothing at all." Miss Marple nodded politely. "Yes. It may be." But her eyes remained fixed on the lace curtains. Curtains were meant to hide the ordinary parts of life from curious eyes. They protected privacy and softened the light that entered a room. Yet sometimes, Miss Marple knew, they were used to hide something much more serious. And as she continued to watch the silent window across the lane, she felt a quiet certainty begin to grow. Something had changed inside that cottage. And whatever lay hidden behind those lace curtains was not meant to be discovered. Chapter 2: The Shadow Behind the Lace Curtains. The quiet rhythm of St. Mary Mead continued as the afternoon slowly moved toward evening. The breeze drifted gently along the lane, stirring the hedges and carrying the faint scent of flowers from nearby gardens. From the outside, nothing about the village seemed unusual. Yet inside Miss Marple's small cottage, a thoughtful silence had settled. Miss Marple continued her knitting, though her attention returned again and again to the cottage across the lane. The lace curtains remained tightly closed. They hung motionless in the window, forming a delicate barrier between the outside world and whatever lay hidden inside the house. Inspector Ellery had noticed the same thing. He had moved his chair slightly closer to the window, watching the silent cottage with the cautious interest of a man trained to notice small details. Though he had arrived in the village expecting a peaceful visit, he knew from experience that unusual situations often began with something very small. "A strange habit to break so suddenly," he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. Most people repeat their routines without thinking. When a routine changes, it is usually because something has forced it to change." Inspector Ellery looked again toward the cottage. "You are certain she has not returned?" "Quite certain," Miss Marple replied calmly. "The lane has been empty all afternoon." For a moment neither of them spoke. The village clock in the distance struck 5, the slow chimes carrying softly through the air. Normally, within the next hour, Mrs. Whitcombe would return home and begin her usual evening routine. But today the house remained silent. Inspector Ellery finally rose from his chair and walked closer to the window. He studied the house carefully. The garden looked perfectly ordinary, and nothing appeared disturbed. Yet the closed curtains created a strange feeling, as if the house itself were deliberately refusing to reveal what was happening inside. "It might be best to take a closer look," he said. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "That thought had occurred to me." The inspector stepped outside first, and Miss Marple followed slowly along the small path that led to the lane. Together they crossed the short distance to Mrs. Whitcombe's gate. The garden was quiet and neatly arranged, with roses climbing gently along the fence. Inspector Ellery paused near the front door and knocked firmly. The sound echoed inside the house. No answer came. He knocked again, slightly louder this time, but the result was the same. The house remained silent. Miss Marple glanced toward the window where the lace curtain still hung. "It is most unusual," she murmured. Inspector Ellery tested the door handle carefully. To his surprise, it turned easily. "The door is unlocked," he said quietly. They exchanged a brief glance before stepping inside. The sitting room was dim, the early evening light barely reaching through the tightly closed curtains. The furniture was arranged neatly, exactly as one would expect from a careful and orderly person like Mrs. Whitcombe. At first nothing seemed wrong. But then Inspector Ellery noticed something on the small table near the sofa. A teacup. The tea inside had long since grown cold. Miss Marple moved slowly through the room, her eyes quietly examining every detail. The room was tidy, yet there was a faint feeling that something had been interrupted. A chair was slightly out of place, and one of the curtains appeared to have been pulled with unusual force. Inspector Ellery walked toward the window and carefully opened the curtains. The fading daylight filled the room. That was when they both saw the small dark mark on the carpet near the sofa. Inspector Ellery bent down, studying it closely. His expression changed at once. "It is blood," he said. Miss Marple did not look surprised. She simply stood quietly, her hands folded as she studied the room with thoughtful calm. "But there is no body," the inspector added. "No," Miss Marple said softly. The inspector straightened slowly. "So someone has been hurt here?" Miss Marple nodded. "And someone else has tried very carefully to hide it." Inspector Ellery looked once more at the delicate lace curtains that had concealed the room from outside view. Suddenly their purpose felt very clear. They had not been closed out of habit. They had been closed to hide what had happened inside the house. And whatever had occurred behind those lace curtains had clearly been serious enough to leave blood on the floor, and silence in the entire cottage. Miss Marple looked around the room one more time before speaking quietly. "I believe," she said gently, "that Mrs. Whitcombe's perfect routine has finally been broken." Inspector Ellery met her gaze. "And when routines break," he said, "the truth usually follows." Outside, the evening shadows slowly stretched across the lane of St. Mary Mead. But inside the quiet cottage, the mystery behind the lace curtains had only just begun to reveal itself. Chapter 3: The Truth Hidden Behind the Lace Curtains. The discovery inside Mrs. Whitcombe's cottage changed the quiet mood of the evening entirely. Inspector Ellery stood near the small table, his sharp eyes moving slowly across the room as he examined every detail. The mark on the carpet was unmistakable, and the cold cup of tea suggested that something had interrupted an ordinary moment. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. She had taken a seat near the window once again, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she observed the room with quiet patience. Years of studying human nature had taught her that truth often revealed itself through the smallest details. Inspector Ellery paced slowly across the sitting room. "There was clearly some sort of struggle," he said thoughtfully. "The chair has been moved, the tea left unfinished, and the blood on the carpet confirms that someone was injured." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes. But the most interesting detail is still the curtains." Inspector Ellery glanced toward the window. "The curtains?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "They were closed far earlier than usual." The inspector folded his arms as he considered this. So the person responsible wanted to hide what happened inside the room. Exactly. He walked slowly toward the door. But if Mrs. Whitcombe was injured here, where is she now? Miss Marple looked toward the staircase leading to the upper floor. That is a very important question. Inspector Ellery climbed the stairs carefully, checking each room one by one. The bedroom appeared untouched. The wardrobe was closed, the bed neatly made, and nothing seemed disturbed. Yet there was no sign of Mrs. Whitcombe anywhere in the house. When he returned downstairs, his expression had grown more serious. She is not here. Miss Marple did not seem surprised. No, she said quietly. I suspected as much. Inspector Ellery stood beside the window, thinking carefully. If she was attacked here, someone must have taken her away. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Or she left willingly. The inspector looked at her with interest. You believe she may still be alive? Miss Marple gave a thoughtful smile. I believe something about Mrs. Whitcombe has never quite matched the peaceful life she pretended to live. Inspector Ellery waited as she continued. You see, when Mrs. Whitcombe first arrived in St. Mary Mead, she claimed she wished for a quiet life after many difficult years. Yet she never spoke of family, never received visitors, and rarely discussed her past. Most people found that perfectly reasonable. And you did not? The inspector asked. Miss Marple shook her head gently. My dear inspector, people who wish to hide their past often create a life that appears perfectly simple. But human nature always leaves small clues. Inspector Ellery leaned slightly closer. What sort of clues? Miss Marple gestured toward the sitting room. For example, Mrs. Whitcombe always closed the curtains herself at 6 o'clock. It was a habit she never forgot. Yes. But today the curtains were closed before she left the house. The inspector thought about it. So whoever closed them was not following the routine. Precisely. Miss Marple stood slowly and walked toward the small table where the cold tea still sat untouched. This tea tells us something else as well. Inspector Ellery looked down at the cup. What does it tell us? That Mrs. Whitcombe was not alone. The inspector frowned slightly. How can you be certain? Miss Marple pointed toward the tray. There are 2 cups. Inspector Ellery looked again and realized she was right. One cup had been used, and the other had only a faint mark along its rim. So she had a visitor. Yes. And that visitor is likely the person responsible for the blood on the carpet. Miss Marple nodded. Inspector Ellery moved quickly toward the door. Then we must find out who visited her today. Miss Marple spoke calmly before he could leave. I believe I already know. The inspector stopped. You do. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully toward the quiet lane outside. Earlier this afternoon, just before Mrs. Whitcombe left her house, a dark motorcar stopped briefly near the gate. It was not a vehicle I recognized from the village. Inspector Ellery listened carefully. A man stepped out and spoke with her for several minutes. They appeared to be arguing. And you did not mention this earlier, he asked. Miss Marple smiled gently. I wished to be certain of my thoughts first. The inspector considered the information carefully. Did you recognize the man? Miss Marple nodded slowly. I had seen him once before, some months ago, when he briefly visited the village. His name is Mr. Charles Whitcombe. The inspector's eyebrows rose. Her husband? Yes. Inspector Ellery looked around the room again as the truth began to take shape. So the husband arrives unexpectedly. They argue. Something happens inside the room. There is blood, and now both of them are missing. Miss Marple returned to her chair calmly. Yes. Inspector Ellery placed his hands on the back of a chair as he thought. If Mrs. Whitcombe was injured, he may have taken her away. Miss Marple gave a small nod. That is certainly possible. But something about this still feels strange, the inspector added. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled slightly. I believe you are quite right. The inspector looked at her expectantly. What have I missed? Miss Marple spoke slowly and carefully. You see, Inspector, people often assume that the person who disappears must be the victim. He waited. But that is not always the case. Inspector Ellery's eyes widened slightly as the idea formed. You believe Mrs. Whitcombe may not be the victim at all? Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear Inspector, I believe Mrs. Whitcombe has been hiding something for a very long time. The inspector looked once more at the faint bloodstain on the carpet. And tonight, he said quietly, the truth finally caught up with her. Outside, the evening had fully settled over St. Mary Mead. Lamps began to glow in cottage windows, and the peaceful village returned to its calm routine. Yet the secret behind the lace curtains had finally been uncovered. Somewhere beyond the quiet lanes, the final pieces of the mystery were already moving into place, and Inspector Ellery knew that before long the full story would emerge. Miss Marple, however, simply picked up her knitting again. Human nature had once again revealed its pattern, just as she had expected. And if you enjoyed uncovering this mystery behind the lace curtains, be sure to subscribe to the channel and join us for more quiet secrets and clever puzzles from the world of Miss Marple. In villages like St. Mary Mead, even the smallest detail can hide a story waiting to be discovered.